key, again, strategy by design for this is to have this iterative feedback loop with this group representing all those different levels. You'll also see then on the next slide, the structure and the fact that this is truly a global group and representing even from outside the United States allows for these kinds of contributions and decades of experience and expertise to be provided at all these levels to get us to where we are right now. We also will have 4 working groups that go beyond the council structure. And in fact, our first one you'll hear about in a moment that's already been formed is the research team led by our colleague, Elizabeth Foster. And we are in the process of inviting and getting started on the next, which is the writing and content development team. And those 3 that are below the research team will all be in operation in 2021 to help inform both the tool development that will follow the standards, the fact that there's an eye towards district and state policy, and also at the province level, very important to how do we advance ownership and adoption of the standards. And then finally, a review team comprised of, again, key individuals for that process to make sure both we are not leaving out any critical points by that time in the process for the standards, as well as avoiding redundancy as well. So that is a quick overview of the council structure, and wanted to share just briefly, and Elizabeth will do this, for what the research team agenda has been about and the work so far, as well as the individuals on the research team. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, and good morning. Good to see so many of you this morning. As Paul mentioned, the standards research team is the first working team that we've formed as part of this nested structure of advisors and contributors. And as you can see on this slide, we have assembled really an outstanding group of experts in professional learning research. Carol Campbell brings a vast amount of experience as well as a global perspective. Maria Heiler, who you'll hear from on our panel in a little bit, is the Deputy Director of the Learning Policy Institute Washington, D.C. office. And actually, we've drawn on her work in professional learning meta-analysis recently. Laura De Simone, I think a lot of you probably recognize her name as a longtime expert in professional learning research. Heather Hill is also an expert, professor at Harvard, and recently has launched a lab to look specifically at how educators and researchers can collaborate on research and application of research. Kelly Kim, who I believe is in the room today, has a long history with the standards as well as research related to professional learning and leadership. She's worked on an evaluation of a statewide implementation of the standards, so brings that perspective as well. And then Jeremy Rochelle with Digital Promise brings an expertise in the learning sciences to this team. So this team is a model for how the other teams will work, but you can also see that they bring a range of experience and expertise and have been advising us, sending us resources, asking us really challenging questions and making recommendations about what is included in the draft revised standards. So I'll just give you a short update. We are fortunate to have been able to partner with the American Institutes of Research to do a literature review using the current standards as a framework and looking specifically at randomized control trial studies that included a professional learning intervention and demonstrated changes in observable teacher practice as well as student outcomes. So they have looked at, they started with, I think, 7,000 a database of 7,000 studies, narrowed it down to a scan of 1,300 studies, and then really focused in on the 38 studies that fit those tight parameters. And we are seeing this as a critical building block in the foundation of research that's informing the standards revision. And I'd say the key takeaways from that literature review, which we are using internally as a team and in collaboration with the Standards Advisory Council, is that they identified where the research, where key concepts of the current standards were present in research studies, and then also where some emerging areas of interest that we're incorporating in the revision also emerged in the research. And we are not sharing, we're not publishing the literature review, but we will share a research brief in the next couple of months, highlighting the key takeaways and talking about some of the key questions that emerged from this literature review. Our next step with AIR is that we are currently engaged in the coding process for a meta-analysis in which they will look at 60 studies that include the studies from the literature review, but also an additional 25 or so that look at changes in teacher practice and are not necessarily as explicit about the student outcome measure. And this is really to help us understand more fully and to parse out the elements of professional learning that result in those intended outcomes. And I will say that this partnership with the research team, with the Standards Advisory Council, and with AIR is really also helping Learning Forward scope and shape our research agenda for the future. So we're sort of thinking of it as the standards revision and beyond. And it's been a really exciting, challenging, interesting opportunity for all of us to work together on this. So that is, I think, one last thing I'll say in closing is that we are eager for feedback. So we are eager for feedback, recommendations for studies, interesting research articles you've found that you think are relevant to the revision process. Please do share those with us. And that is my final word. I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And I think that leads into a nice piece that Tracy's going to touch on briefly in this next slide, because I think there's always a question for any standards about why change, why revise, especially if they've been working and they reflect really the full scope of professional learning. And so Tracy's going to just walk through briefly, some key points about what has changed, and as we all know, especially in the last 10 years, some of those pieces. So with that, I'll turn to Tracy.
All right, thanks, Paul. And so you see 4 key points on the slide, and I'll say, as we approach this revision, we recognize that in 2020, we understand a lot more about what constitutes a meaningful professional learning system and effective learning teams and high quality leadership for professional learning. There's so much more information available to us now about the impact of high quality instructional materials and curriculum. The college and career ready standards have been out there now for as long as the last version of the standards for professional learning, and that certainly has had an impact on what and how educators learn and the practices they need to use. And of course, our aspirations to equity have greater clarity. And we know more from our stakeholders and from the wisdom of the field about what's important in supporting implementation. So, pardon me, one point I want to make is that in terms of the implementation, an approach we're taking that's different around in this revision is the standards, the revised standards for professional learning will be released at the same time that we release implementation tools. So for example, innovation configuration maps by role. And in the past, sometimes we've rolled those out because we're so eager to get as much new information out as we can. And we also recognize that having the full suite of resources out at the same time really empowers folks to get busy changing systems, changing practices, taking action, and moving toward implementation. And when we look at our push toward let's get these standards into policy. And that we've had a strong emphasis on states adopting and adapting standards so that there is both pressure and support to change what happens in school systems and what happens at the state level, how things work at the provincial, national level. We also want to make sure that those who are implementing standards have what they need to make the improvements that we all aspire to. So I'll just say that those are sort of our guiding lights as we consider the revision. And we're going to focus in now for the next while on one particular aspect of that, equity. And I will say one of the questions when the 2011 standards were released was, where did the equity standard go? Because there had been an equity standard in the 2001 standards. And that was an intentional decision because you don't want to separate equity from anything. It has to be threaded throughout standards. And it is threaded throughout the 2011 standards. It's the very stem of every standard. It's all over that document. And at the same time, what are the ways that educators now require more explicit support and recognition of what we need to work on deeply? So I'm excited that we're going to talk about that. And so as our four panelists come onto the Zoom stage, we will ask those who are not panelists or the moderator, Paul, we're going to turn off our cameras and let those folks talk. It's so wonderful to have so many people in the room. If you are adept with your Zoom tools, you know that there is by your video settings control, you can hide all non-video participants. So we'll only see those who are presenting for us today. So Paul, I turn it over to you, and so glad we'll have our panelists with us.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And as we said, we're so excited now to spend really about the next almost 60 minutes with this next part of the panel in this session with our four panelists. So in a moment, I'm going to ask them to introduce them in the order in which they're going. And then after the four introductions, we'll focus on this as the beginning question that you see on the slide. And then this is where we do hope that you're able to post comments or questions in the chat box, because after they're done each speaking for about 5 minutes each, we want the remaining time to be interactive, and we will be fielding those questions and putting them to our panelists from all of you. And so that's really our hope over the next 55 minutes or so. And you can see again, this first question that they'll be addressing is thinking about, based especially on their experience and expertise, why is this area of equity now critical for educators, given that we know equity is multidimensional, it has many aspects, and it is so glaring as we see right now some of the historical and current inequities due to COVID, as well as the social justice movement. And so we're going to ask them to talk a little bit about that, and also how it connects to these other areas of focus within the standards, like you see, curriculum, transformation, research as well. So in the order, I'm very excited first to have Nader Twal to introduce himself first, and then we will go in order just with some quick introductions first. So Nader.
Hi, I'm Nader Twal. I am Program Administrator in the Office of Curriculum, Instruction, and Professional Development in Long Beach, California.
Great, thank you so much, Nader. We'll go now to Maria Heiler second.
Hello, good morning or afternoon. My name is Maria Heiler, and I am Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office and a senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute.
Thank you so much. And our third panelist today is Principal Marlon Williams.
Good morning. Hi, my name is Marlon Williams. I'm the principal of the Dr. Daniel Hill Williams School of the Arts, Bronx, New York.
Great, thank you so much. And our final panelist is Sandra Alberti.
Hello, Sandra Alberti. I work at Student Achievement Partners, a new organization. So my new title is a designer, which is perfectly suitable to our conversation today. Happy to be with all of you.
Great, thank you. And as you can see and appreciate, Rochelle, the comment already that we have such a great range of perspectives at different levels. And so that's why we're excited to dig in. We're going to start with you, Nader, to kick us off and share with us, especially around this question about why does equity matter, right, for educators? Thanks.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me when I think about this question, Paul, is that equity's always mattered. I think our consciousness around equity has been heightened, maybe by circumstances in the world, maybe by the pandemic, but there's a shared assumption now that this is an important conversation to have and to define. And so why is it important in education specifically? Well, the answer to that to me is that we're a human-centered enterprise and our main currency is relationships. And that to build meaningful relationships that anchor the work that we do as educators, we have to know and value our kids. And when I say that we value our kids, it's not in our intention, it's in their experience. It's in the community experience, it's in the students' experience that we know that the work that we're doing is actually causing them to feel valued. And so the information that we gather about them as we learn, as we develop these relationships, are the things that help us to bridge to the content or the curriculum. It's how we help them to connect to the curriculum. So another way to say it might be if relevance is what makes rigor possible, then relationships are what make relevance meaningful. And so when I think about that, I think about the fact that we have to have foundational beliefs that are then codified in practice, that it's easy to go through the motions and tick boxes, right? Like I've got pictures on my wall that represent all the kids in my class. I use the word equity, therefore I must be equitable. It has to go a little bit deeper than that because we have to have our belief system match. And so a foundational belief might sound something like all students and communities come to us with cultural and linguistic assets. And if that's the case, how do we capitalize on those assets? Well, they deserve to be treated with dignity, fairness, respect, and unconditional positive regard. Every student matters and needs to feel like they do. Do I really believe that? Do I ask them? Do I involve them in the process? Does our professional learning cause me to reflect on that? And so if we don't believe that that system matters, then we're never going to have to confront our own bias. In the standards, there's this story in one of the equity standards where it's kind of played out of a teacher who has to confront her bias in math. She thought that math, doesn't deal with this stuff, right? Because math is very like numbers. We don't have to deal with equity in the same way. So I really think I'm equitable. But when confronted with some of her practices, who she calls on, distribution of grades, she began to reflect differently around her work. And so when I think about the fact that we're a human-centered enterprise, by nature, then we're social emotional beings. And you can't do real social emotional learning and really address that fully absent equity. You can't possibly do it because then it's just informed by what you would want, not necessarily what they actually need because you've taken the time to get to know them. So when I think about standards and how it connects to that, and when I think about how that then affects research, transformation, and curriculum, I think that especially in this time, we have the opportunity to either be reactive or responsive. And when you're reactive, you're going with your gut. You're responding with a deficit mentality. You're trying to fill a gap that's now been, that's been surfaced, and it's immediate, it's pressing, and you're just going with what you know today. When you're responsive, you hit pause, you thoughtfully and intentionally begin to adapt behavior to the circumstances, and you are responsive. You're not waiting 6 years to respond, but you're trying to be a little bit more methodical and systemic about it. And I think the standards give us that opportunity. And so we need a coherent definition of equity in order to organize and center our thinking. If we don't have a common definition, we don't have a common third point to react to and to challenge one another's understanding. So absent a definition and a framework to organize our thinking, I think we can become too subjective and rely on our best intentions and experiences instead of our best learning and practices. And those intentions that we have might be rooted in long histories of unsurfaced, unconscious bias. And so I think about our efforts, especially around traditionally marginalized and underserved communities, and how we look at what we call the achievement gap. And then we begin to fill that gap by filling kids' schedules with interventions and additional classes, because that's what they need, right? Because that's what they need. We want to give them what they need. Well, maybe those intentions are rooted in the wrong thing. Maybe it's our instruction. Maybe it's the assessment. Maybe it's the curriculum that's the gap. Are we asking the right questions? So we need to have ways to operationalize this intention toward equity. And with the innovation configurations and the definitions and the stories and the essential elements that are named in the standards, we actually have an opportunity now to hit pause, look at something outside ourselves, and begin to actually calibrate collectively. Whether we agree with every word or not, we now have something around which to organize our thinking. So I think what it does is it helps us to move away from knowing enough to be dangerous to anchoring us in real criteria that helps us to move developmentally toward real equity. So that's just kind of my reflection on it initially.
Yeah, and just a powerful opening, Nana. So thank you for setting some frames that we will definitely come back to with our panelists to continue, and also with our audience, because there was so much in there. So thank you. And that's a great lead in really for this perspective that Maria represents, and thinking about all of the body of evidence and research, and how that's both visible and not visible, right, when we're considering equity as a frame. So thank you again, Nader. We're going to turn to Maria as our second panelist to continue.
I second to thank you, Nader. Really a lot to think about. And I really appreciate your opening, which was equity has always mattered. And I think that it's always mattered, but it's mattered differently to different people and different constituencies. And people don't always understand how it matters, which is why I'll spend a few minutes just talking about the intersection of equity and research around professional development and professional learning. You have me thinking about, in particular, the expectations, the growing expectations on teachers, and how we expect teachers to be prepared for diverse student populations, linguistically, ability, racial, sexual identification, and gender identity, and all the ways that diversity can show up in our classrooms. And we don't have the same expectations for our researchers. And so I think about that, and I think the same way that we now have a bar of how we prepare and how we develop teachers around thinking about equity in classrooms and schools and districts, we need to have that same expectation for researchers, in particular around professional learning and professional development. So when we think about the type of research that is embodied in research on professional learning, we see often equity absent from that. It's research that does give some information that's really important. But if we think about the endeavor, the experiment of public education in the United States, we really need to see equity being centered in all work. So that's the research, the professional learning, the preparation, the career lattices. And on the side of researchers, that shows up in the ways in which we value certain types of research. One of the key pieces of research out of Learning Policy Institute on effective professional development is an example of this. I'm an author on the publication, and it's good work. We have in that study 35 studies of teacher professional learning, and we comb through hundreds of studies. And our criteria for inclusion was an impact on student learning, which was very specific, and also methodological rigor. And, you know, if I were to go back and do that study again, I would open that up a bit. Not to say that those aren't key and really important pieces for this work in understanding the impact of professional learning. But we need to open the canon of research and what we consider as methodologically rigorous. And also in thinking about multiple literature reviews of studies is really important as well, because I think it was key that we looked at studies that impacted student learning, but there's a whole slew of research studies that could have been included or need to be looked at as well that impacts teachers' perceptions, changes in teachers' practice. And so just thinking about the body of literature and professional learning, really opening that up and helping people to see a value in research that not necessarily has been thought of as part of the canon. And that's analogous to how we now see a different canon in literature, right? There was always these canonical readings that had to be done in K-12 schools. And now I think it's time to open up that canon in research as well. And you see the niches growing, like there's a lot of research on decolonizing curriculum and anti-racist practices and thinking about research in new and better ways. But we need to move that more from the peripheral into the expectations of how we engage in research, in particular around professional learning. And that means that would change the way research looks like. We would often, the studies that are done are, the context is very similar. You know, you'll find large suburban schools. You're not finding the research done in urban centers or in schools where it's primarily students of color, or in rural settings where it's high poverty areas for students. So thinking about that and thinking about who gets center stage in the research is really important, and how those studies often rise, and those are the ones that get into the peer-reviewed journals. And so thinking about research in that way is really important. And when we think about the range of research, also thinking about for districts and schools, what type of data is most important for you? I don't necessarily think that looking at randomized controlled trials is going to give the information that you really need to think about what's the best PD for our teachers and our students learning. So thinking about less seat time, because oftentimes districts and states track effectiveness of PD, or track PD in terms of seat time, how many hours for continuing education for teachers, and really thinking about quality of professional learning and how to collect data around that. So really, you know, does this PD have a central focus on equity? And what does that look like for our student population? Because of course, we are so geographically diverse that equity looks different in Iowa than it does in Nebraska than it does in California. So really thinking about what does equity mean for our student population, and who are those students that are farthest from equitable opportunities, and who are those who are closest, looks differently wherever you are. So thinking about how to collect that data as a district or school. Definitely hearing from teachers if the PD was effective and meaningful for them. And I think that we are swinging the pendulum really far towards teacher voice, which we need to do. But in addition to that, we have to see what the impact on student learning is, because we can often enjoy PD and not have it have impact on what's really important, which is student learning, student experiences, student sense of belonging, all those pieces that make schools the types of places where deeper learning and equity can be centered. Thinking about the also alignment of PD with the school and district priorities. You know, we want alignment in the work that we're doing. So in thinking about what PD is effective, or what PD is most impactful for a school, a district, a classroom, you have to think about also the alignment of the goals. And hopefully that's something that all stakeholders are having a conversation in, and it just doesn't come straight down from the district, but that teachers are also giving input about that as well. So I'm going to pause there. That's a lot of information. And I'm happy to dig into more of that later.
No, that's wonderful. And I think so far this is really, I think hopefully for everyone, like drinking from a very strong fire hose in such a knowledge-rich way, which is exciting. And thank you, Maria, because I think you've also now started really a new charge for us, right? Open that canon, I think, is becoming a charge in the research for equity research that seems to be really important, as well as changing the lens in which we view equity in all the levels that you talked about, which I think is a great now lead in to our last two panelists speaking, kind of really saying, what does that really look like for students in a school level? And then also how to really embed this more deeply in a systems approach at the national level and for organizations that support equity. So with that, we're going to go to Principal Williams to take us next on our third panelist.
Good morning, everyone. I have to say, Paul, you read my mind. First, I gotta say, first, it's exciting to be sitting with such a group of such super smart people talking about such an important topic. And as Nadir was talking, as Maria was talking, you're right. It seemed like we went to first base, second base. Now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, as a school principal, the greatest thing about my job is about actionalizing a vision and taking theory and taking practice and taking ideas about learning and taking ideas about how children learn and making that a reality and trying to serve your community, the families and children you have. But also I'm keenly aware that the research is miles ahead of the people who are sitting in the classroom. And so that's where professional learning comes in. And that's where the great work of an organization like Learning Forward is significant, because Nadir was right. Like, there has to be a coherent definition and framework as I'm engaging my teachers. And so we've got to remember, I feel like a dinosaur. I started teaching in 1996. And so, yeah, my good Lord, right? And so I think about how much our field has changed. You know, that was before Common Core. That was before, yeah, Maria, I see you. Yeah, me too. It was before Common Core. It was before smart boards. I was walking around with chart papers and transparencies, and the language that we're using now just didn't exist. And then we even take that a step further when we talk about equity. I'm a proud New Yorker, love my city, but I'm honest about the fact that I live in one of the most segregated cities in the nation. So I want you to sit in that for a minute. Several million students, but it's one of the most segregated places in the nation. And comparable to a lot of school districts, the majority of my teachers who are sitting in front of students in New York City are white females. And you've got well-intended educators. I believe the majority of my folk, their heart's in the right place. But at the same time, we, including me, carry our bias.
Oh, Marlon, I think you hit mute. I think yeah.
Oh,
There you go.
I'm back.
Yeah, you're
okay.
back.
I was saying all of us, we have well-intended educators, including myself, that carry our biases into the classroom every day. And so to think about that, if I self-identify as an African-American male of Caribbean descent who grew up in a fundamentalist Christian house, I carry a whole bucket of biases into the work. And so we need a framework. We need a coherent definition for how we're gonna attack that and change that. Because my work as a principal, a large part of it is about adult learning. And I don't think enough emphasis put on that in principal training programs. My job is to shift the mindsets of adults around what is best for children and how we serve the children that we serve. And so it's working every day. So you're right, it goes from research to policy to daily practice. And so sitting on a panel like this and discussing and thinking about equity now, it's inequity has never been more visible than it is now. If you're thinking about access to technology, if you're thinking about who has Wi-Fi, something as simple as that, that right now, that is one of the central issues in learning right now. Can I log in? Can I get on? Who has access to technology? The pre-existing challenges that are now carried into learning today, where if I entered middle school on a third grade reading level, and I've had negative experience with educators, how do we build community remotely? And now, one of the challenges for educators is now I'm inside your house. And so I'm inside your house and I'm seeing your family in a different way. And there are people, normally the teacher has the whole classroom to themselves. But in this current reality, in this current iteration, your parents are sitting in the back and they're hearing how you're talking to little Timmy. They're hearing whether or not you're calling on their child. And so everything's been opened up in a way that there is such a central focus on what's equitable, what's inequitable, and how that impacts each and every student. And so the discussion is alive and it's exciting. And one of the important things for me Teachers, when it comes to professional learning, forgive me, group, teachers are a tough audience. Can we say it nicely like that? And so they are very bottom dollar. And so they say what's important to you, you assess. And I think for teachers, because for so long they've been assessed on reading and math. When we move into elements of equity, unless you can find interest convergence, unless you can find a way for the teachers to understand this diverse body, those people who've been teaching 25 to 30 years, and those teachers who've been teaching 1 month and 3 years, who are just trying to survive in some ways, you got to find a way to let them understand why this is significant, why this does matter, why the example of the math teacher was dead on. You know, we talked about the paucity of resources for equity work in math when we were talking last time, Paul. Having them understand, yes, it's more than just the 3 R's, but it really is about, this is a central component that weaves through everything that we're doing. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate, Marlon, the focus also on adult learners, because as you can see in the chat box, and as you mentioned, so much are on teachers' plates right now to really help and support them have that equity mindset and have those equitable set of strategies is a significant shift, as you were talking about. And I think that's one important reason why, as Nader mentioned earlier, what we're trying to do with the revised standards is to try to highlight some of those supports and shifts to make equity more visible and more shareable, right? More public, more visible, more shareable, so that everyone is working from the same playbook, right? And that's often the challenge, as you know, working with educators and getting everybody to buy in, but also the why. So I love what you were saying about the why. I think that's another piece that you also highlighted around the importance on racial equity specifically, and that is addressed, and that is not often, sometimes is the elephant in the room, right? And I know that's also a piece, Sandra, you were going to be touching on as well. And so this is a great segue to you. And then again, thank you as you continue to put comments and questions in the chat, because we will be using those for our discussion going forward. So thank you. And with that, to Sandra, thanks.
Thank you all very much. And, just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate that in the midst of the pandemic that we're in, that all of you who have signed up for this session and all of the folks at Learning Forward who are working on this are still finding the energy to commit to these issues of equity that are so critically important. And so I share with you my thoughts that I don't want to gloss over, that my work at Student Achievement Partners has, for 10 years been squarely focused on math and literacy, and what are we doing to help all students achieve in math and literacy. And as we as an organization and myself individually reflect on what that has looked like from conversation, presentation, list of resources, we are really feeling that we have left equity as an assumption. Of course we mean this for all students. We've always meant this for all students. That's what we were built on. And it's not quite the same thing when you name this work that is so necessary in front of us, that we need to understand that in order to do the work of helping every student to thrive in our schools, we need to know more than just our content, but we also need to know about our students, and we need to know about ourselves. And so critical to this work, and so appreciative of the inclusion of this across many of the standards, that we see the work of, however you want to call it, anti-racism, if you want to call it addressing unconscious bias, as a developmental opportunity, and therefore a very important priority for professional learning. I'm sure that's why we're all in this conference engaged together, because we believe that it is our responsibility as professionals to constantly think about our own practices, think about our own assumptions, think about our own beliefs, so that we can continue to serve our students better. And, of the many, many things that I've been reading, many, many hours of almost every day in the months that we have been in quarantine, so important that we remind ourselves that we are not in a binary space, that we are not in the space of, bad racist, good anti-racist, but that there's all this work to do in between. And that's the work of learning. And if we spend our energy in defending our positions, we are consuming the energy that could otherwise be spent in professional learning going forward. And so I hope that what these standards in part do is set an agenda for learning, that the work of equity isn't just nice to do, isn't just the work to do in the moment, but we will never get where we want to get in reading scores, in math scores, in high school graduation rates, in attendance, all of the things that show students belonging in our schools, all of the things that we signal as signs, and hopefully those also expand to Maria's point that we think about new indicators of success. We won't get to any of those if we don't first think about equity as being integral and inseparable from the work of all of the other things that we develop. So we need to acknowledge, and Paul and Nader and I had a conversation last week, some of this is tough to say. I've been in education longer than 1996. Thank you, Marlon. And we will just say that we have all grown up in and have worked in a system that we need to name as a white supremacist system that does not serve all students well. We can look at this data, I thought, just to name it, NAEP scores 2017, we have 45% of our white students achieving at proficient level in reading, 45% of white students. That same test, that same day, year of data tells us only 18% of our Black students are reaching those levels and only 23% of our Hispanic students. We need to get beyond blaming our students for that and putting that on the shoulders of our students and what they bring to us. How different it is to look at that data and say, we know how to teach white students well. We don't know how to teach our students of color well. So what is our professional learning agenda going to look like that helps us get there? It is our work to figure out, not the work of our students or their families to figure out. It's our work to figure out. So that this shouldn't just be an add-on going forward. And what is so important, and I know Paul's gonna get to the next really super exciting slide to look at these standards that are part of this draft, to think about equity. Tracy mentioned at the beginning, like, is it a standard by itself? Is it embedded in all of the standards? But elevating this as a developmental teachable priority, I think is one of the many things that is super exciting about the standards. Now, for my role at Student Achievement Partners, when we talked about, what we once used to easily say Common Core and now more often say college and career ready standards, often people would say to me, come on, Sandra, these are standards. Are they just, they're just aspirations, right? You don't really think that people are going to do this. Like, they're just aspirations. And what standards, from Nader's comments, Maria's comments, Marlon's comments, what the standards allow us to do is to paint this vision, to have this common language, to say, this isn't a nice to do. This isn't like, hey, who's your latest administrator that you hired? Maybe this is going to be their agenda, but that putting this issue of equity in the context with curriculum assessment and instruction, putting it in the context with all of the conditions necessarily to create a culture of professional learning is critical. And I think it is on all of us to make sure that we don't have a conversation that doesn't start with the very important questions of not just our intentions in this work, but and I think that's really critical going forward. Don't want to go too much longer because I know we have some questions, but just some other things to think about is the difference between, complaining about this work and being committed to this work. The difference between taking responsibility versus finding places for blame. Marlon mentioned just some of the many, many, many challenges that we are all facing because of COVID, but the fact that we have elevated things that have always been the case in our education systems, and realizing that that is an opportunity for us. So just the last analogy, I think that is so fitting for professional learning standards and this idea of continuous learning as part of our job. I mean, can we all hopefully acknowledge that part of the reason why we became teachers in one frame or another is because we love learning, and this idea of a professional learning agenda, so important. And so as we think about professional learning in total, and particularly professional learning centered on issues of our own biases, as well as how we can best serve our students, is that this isn't just a, let's do this for the next 3 years. This isn't, as one of Tracy Benson and Sarah Fairman book that I just finished reading called, this isn't like, let's just get our tonsils removed and then we're done. We've done the anti-racist thing, we've done the equity access thing, but that we need to think about this as all of our learning as kind of daily dental hygiene. Are we every day acknowledging that some plaque is building up, and every day, morning and night, we need to brush our teeth because this stuff is always there. And so when we think about putting all of these standards together and really creating a culture of professional learning, it is the only way that we are going to do what I believe is possible, is to really make sure every student attending school in this country and around the world has an opportunity to thrive, feels themselves valued, feels themselves seen, heard, and has the ability to, pursue any of their dreams that they certainly come to us with. So I appreciate the Learning Forward team for leading on this, for pushing us to really think about this, not just as a tagline, but that we really are thinking about how we as a profession can be much more direct and clear about our absolute commitment to serving all of our students, which comes with a commitment to looking at the work ourselves internally, as well as what we decide to do externally with our peers and our students.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And that's really echoing our other three panelists, and so much food for thought around. What I'm going to do, based on Sandra's last piece, is ask you a pretty challenging follow-up question here. And this actually reflects Yanira Stoker's comment in the chat box. So thank you. And Nader, you're going to be the first one that I'm going to volunteer to take this this follow-up on, but it's really open to all of you after that. And this will allow also for other folks, but it does really capture a lot of what we've heard so far from all of you and from the audience members, right? So if we want equity to be elevated, if we want it to be in the DNA of every system, and it's no longer just an initiative that's a checkbox that we move on and say we've done this, but rather, again, lives and breathes as the DNA of Long Beach, right? The DNA of Marlin, your school, the middle school level, of the DNA of LPI, right? And SAP. How do we move from, that idea of it's an initiative to true ownership and thinking at a level that pushes people and also thinks about modeling equity in a way that's not just lip service, which I know is a very large question, but I think it's one that we're going to be grappling with, so that the standards don't look pretty, sound pretty, and change nothing, right? But rather really thinking deeply, as we're trying to do, even through the structures you'll see with the standards, of some equity explicit standards, to think about practice and how to change it, to think about policy and how to change it. So, with all that being said, is kind of a quick follow-up question here, is moving again from initiative to a systems approach. How, especially in Long Beach, Nader, have you been thinking about that to start? That'd be great.
So I don't know that I can speak for the whole district because it's such a big initiative, and we have board committees meeting, we have curriculum audits going on, and there are a lot of hands in it. What I can speak to is my experience of it in our department, and specifically in the area of professional learning. And I'm going to kind of give an analogy, and I'm going to get real nitty gritty in terms of like operationalizing, right? Not getting philosophical. I used to, as I was going through college, I espouse certain beliefs, and I have, this deep conviction, and I identified a certain way. And someone asked me a question that has stuck with me forever. And at that point, we still had day planners. We didn't have iPhones. They said, if I grabbed your day planner and if I grabbed your checkbook, would there be enough evidence in both of those to show that the values you espouse are actually your values? Would the way you spend your money and the way you spend your time tell me that this is a value that you have? And I've really been thinking a lot about that in terms of this work. So when we talk about how do we make it not a nice sticker, a checkbox, well, is there time devoted to it? To the learning required to the audit, to the reflection, to the change, to the policy rewrite, and our resources allocated accordingly, right? And then I also think about the fact that yesterday there was a session that was happening concurrent to a session that I was in the pre-conference, and it was led by the Core Collaborative, and they had this theory of equity success. And they talked about how you move from like the dysfunction of like, you have this great intent, there's energy, and then it kind of gets stuck, right? Like something's weird there. And they talked about the pivot that really turns it into something that's actually going to change is inclusion. The idea of who's been marginalized and where are they at the table informing the work, so that you end up with this commitment to equity through dignity and belonging. And the dignity is by elevating the voice and actually listening and responding. And then the belonging comes from authentic response to the feedback you're getting. And suddenly you have true engagement. That's kind of the way that they've conceptualized that cycle. And that really resonated with me. And so I think a little bit about, you know, like for me personally in professional development, we've built an online professional learning system that allows teachers to get matched to professional learning based on their self-assessed need, right? So they get to decide, you know, where do I want to grow? And then they're matched. One of the things that we've never thought to do that we're actually starting to do now is we're actually auditing the content that we have that they get matched with. So when they look at the videos of teachers' exemplary practices, who are they seeing? What is the gender distribution? What is the ethnic distribution? What do the classes look like? Because they wanted to see our teachers. They were like, I don't want to see a teacher in Kansas. I want to see a teacher here. And I'm like, totally makes sense to me. And we thought we nailed it. Well, we want to go back and we want to do a little bit of an audit of whose voice is being elevated, whose practice is being modeled. Why do we value that? What was the rubric that we used to decide that that was the practice we wanted to elevate? So we're just asking questions of ourselves. And I think that that's part of it. But the other thing, Paul, and then I want to give the other panelists a chance, is that I think what I like about the idea of the standards is that sometimes we get into analysis paralysis, where we feel like we've all got to get like these 35 doctorates before we can do something. I think that we need to temper that whole, you know, I know enough to be dangerous, so I'm going to go act, right? Like I read my one book and now I'm ready to go write policy, with I need to learn through the process. And the standards, especially when we come out with the innovation configuration, when all that stuff is there, I can learn before I start, but then I can learn while I work, right? And I can learn while I work by making the mistakes and having a context that allows for those mistakes to happen without having them be catastrophic, right? And so I think that's the fear that people have in engaging in this work is, what if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing? Can I recover? And I think if we begin to create contexts where those mistakes become a part of the learning, and that we create a way to respond to it, where we can turn it into a productive cycle and not a fear-based, oh my gosh, if I just trip once, my career is over, I think we're going to see some productive movement.
Great. No, thank you so much. And if there are other panelists that wanted to respond as well, and if there are, while you're thinking of that, there's another question from the chat box about what have been some really important texts or authors that have pushed your thinking around equity and have advanced your thinking that you'd be willing to share. So that's kind of an on-deck question, but we'll want to keep this thread if it sounds like either Maria first and then Marlon. Great.
That question really had me thinking about basically walking the talk, right? And really thinking about ways in which we are engaged in authentic ways of thinking about and engaging in more equitable practices. And so I just like to put out like thinking at a systems level. And so I talked a lot about research. So it begins, if I'm looking at the research end, it begins with organizations like LPI, like AIR, who's doing the research for Learning Forward, to start to interrogate our own actions as an organization. And so the ways in which we're doing that is thinking about, you know, what research do we honor? What do we elevate? Where do we see scholars of color and their work show up in the work that we elevate? Are we engaged in research that honors our participants, that doesn't reify inequities that are currently at practice? So when I think about the research side of things, those are the questions that that part of the system needs to engage in. And then just in general, like, you know, we talk a lot about what's happening in schools and districts and then this organizations, but really thinking about these is all connected in a whole. and what does the system mean, and how do we engage at the systems level? So I was thinking about your comment, Sandra, earlier about that we know how to teach white students. And I agree that's important to look at and think about. I would say that's insufficient knowledge though, right? And I see you nodding that you agree, because I would argue until all of our students are taught well, none of our students are taught well, and thinking about what does it mean to engage our white teachers and white students, if we're talking about racial equity in particular, because there's linguistic equity, you know, gender equity. What does it mean to engage our white students and white teachers in equitable moves, and thinking about how do I engage in anti-racist activities and thinking. And often we know assessments are biased, and when we look at just test scores, that's how we get into the cycle of not understanding how systems have not provided opportunities for students of learning, but looking at students and putting the blame on them, which I know is not what you were doing, but I think there's a nuanced way of talking and thinking about research that I think a lot of people miss. And so it ends up, how do we fix these kids, these schools, these teachers? And we want to stay as far away from that as possible. So thinking about at a school level, you know, we want to embody equity. So looking at the school as a system itself, how do we encourage teachers to think about their own biases when, if you look at leadership, it's all men as department chairs and it's all men in leadership, or, you know, faculty of color are silenced in faculty meetings. So thinking about not only like professional learning and how do we help our teachers to engage in these practices around bias and thinking about what's happening in their pedagogy and in their classroom environments, but also thinking about the system. How does inequity show up in the ways in which our schools are run, in which our districts are run, how we engage in research, and really attacking those challenges at a system level, I think is really important, or at least acknowledging this is my slice, and these are the things that impact my slice.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that really echoes in to Marlon, and maybe on a couple levels to you next is a follow-up. One from Maria, two from John in the chat box, who's asking, how have you designed kind of your whole staff professional learning to address the unique needs of a large staff? And a second piece around, how do you think around designing professional learning from the principal perspective, right? From the leadership perspective, not just about teachers in the classroom, but thinking about it from a leadership role. So.
Wow, Paul, I was looking at John's question too.
Yeah.
I have 125 staff members, and sometimes I feel like I'm turning a battleship. I'm trying to make a change in this institution. I stepped into a school that's 30 years old, that had deep-seated traditions. My first time engaging in equity work, people call it legal. And I was quickly informed we don't talk about race and politics at work. And so you have to be ready, you have to be courageous. I think you have to be courageous as a leader. I've been fortunate to have leadership above me who are very supportive. And in New York City, our current chancellor, all the way down to my superintendent, Chris Vaughn, have been amazing thought partners, and they are passionate about equity. I love that analogy. I'm gonna say it again, brushing your teeth every day. Oh, I'm stealing that. But I love that it's everyday work. And so how do you structure? You are correct. There has to be learning for yourself. You do need external support. This is heavy lifting and it's exhausting to the soul. So it's not something you can do by yourself. And one thing I want to throw into the discussion is you have to be committed to building a diverse group and having all voices in the discussion. And that's challenging, because especially when we talk about race and we talk about equity, even when we talk about sexual orientation, I mean, these issues intersect into values and what people find important and their faith. And these can be very heated discussions. And so you have to be willing to open up dialogue with people who have very different value systems and beliefs, and even a dangerous, a tricky thing to say sometimes, but it's true, in their head and in their heart, They may not feel they're coming from a bad space. And so you asked about books. So I turned off my camera, ran and got like 5 different books. But I encourage you to identify protocols that facilitate those discussions. I think that has been the #1 thing I've done well. If I had to say one thing that was a glow for our community, is we've implemented protocols for having discussions. And that's been very helpful because it gives equity a voice, and it pulls away from the finger pointing. Because it's very easy in those discussions, when you start pointing fingers, the conversation closes. And so what Nader was saying about having common language, a common framework, what Maria was saying about identifying, oh, it was Sandra that was saying, identifying this is everyday work. So people aren't going to feel like, okay, I just have to suffer through this 2 sessions or these 4 sessions, and then we can go back to doing my social studies curriculum. What we did, New York City spent a lot of time working with Courageous Conversations. And so there's a protocol in this book. I'm not selling this one protocol, but I'm saying I found it very helpful because there are protocols and there are agreements and conditions so that it really structures the conversation. I've even been able to use this tool with my cabinet to really have conversations, to have difficult conversations beyond race. So you definitely need to structure the discussion. You have to begin with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is it really can't be one and done. It isn't something you hand off to a consultant, but you really have to learn first yourself. And Nader was right. You have to be willing, you have to be transparent about I'm learning as I go. So I try to self-identify as often as I can, and I try to be transparent about the biases I carry with me. And it helps my team when I say to them, you know, I'm a husband, I'm a father of 2 daughters. That doesn't mean that I cannot be misogynistic. That doesn't mean that I can't hold certain gender biases. And it helps well-meaning educators who might have children of other races, who might have adopted children. Sometimes people get very defensive about the biases they hold, but it starts with us. It starts with turning that camera inward and being honest about, in my hiring practices, how I've surfaced my biases and how I'm combating that. Those kinds of things help the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Marlon. And it sounds like on a couple of levels. One, you're trying to model, right, some of these equity-based practices, protocols, and tools as a leader so that your staff is building capacity. And it reminds me of, even in our revised standards now, we have a standard called, you know, culture of collaborative inquiry. And that can be, right, if what you're saying, if you don't have a leader willing to both model and think deeply about structuring the capacity building of your educators, right, and of your teachers, to talk and give them the tools to talk about equity maybe in a different way, as Nader said, like be willing to take those small steps and the action steps, right, that are there. So that's powerful. Thank you. Yeah, Sandra, I wanted to see if you were wanting to respond to any of those pieces. All right.
Yeah, I mean, in lots, and even in the chat, you know, I also share with many people that I'm also a school board member. And so acknowledging that this is like critical work, because I think part of the unconsciousness of this system is that these barriers exist throughout in, you know, everything from how students participate in an individual classroom to, you know, Marlon mentioned like what we do about Zoom meetings live and like every step is an opportunity to do better or to make a mistake. And by nature, by being unconscious, means it's unconscious. And so I feel like, you know, I think Stephanie asked a question about professional learning design and other things. And I think it goes with this idea of courageous conversations and creating brave spaces, is that we need to, in this professional learning culture, practice the art of giving and receiving feedback, because I think that is a critical piece of this for learning, but particularly for this learning, which is, but we should just acknowledge, challenging. It can be, you know, as Marlon said, burdensome, weighty, and for that reason, often, you know, done and then like did that, like let's move on to the next thing. But that you need to persist with it is super important. And so the idea of a system is really critical because there are so many opportunities to undo good work. But for me, I think super important that we think about diversity of perspective, because I can never have the perspective of a Black student, of a Black principal. I can only have the perspective that I had. I can listen, I can learn, but that will only go so far, no matter how many books I read, if we're not bringing the voices to the conversation of people who have had those diverse experiences. And I know in my own school district, where I'm on the school board, there's a clamoring for a more diverse faculty. And, like many school districts, particularly now, we're not hiring a whole bunch. So we're thinking about what else could we do? How else could we bring diverse role models into the school? Who are our parent volunteers? Who are our, mentors and role models? Like, we need to really think differently about our systems in order to get to this goal of equity, access, and opportunity for all kids. And so I do feel like the system concept is critical to this work, but I also love what Maria said, like, own your slice of the pie, own the thing that you can do. And like I said, it's learning, it's hard. And, I just invite everybody who hasn't yet dived in to do that. And one of the things that I know I committed to doing myself early in the summer is learn from people who I didn't typically learn from. Nader mentioned in his day planner, like, who's in your social media feed? Who are you following on Twitter? Who are you learning from? Who are you listening? Because just like there's a whole research body that we haven't elevated, there's a whole list of people who have been doing magnificent work in this area for decades that we haven't centralized. We need to, open up our brains, our thoughts to what they have to offer, because it's really quite incredible. And, let's acknowledge that things that seem stuck aren't so stuck.
Paul, can I respond to that a little bit? Because honestly, listening to Maria, Marlon, and Sandra has really sparked something for me, which is that I think sometimes we take comfort in standards because they're clean, right? They're there, they're in print. And I want to make sure that in talking about centering our stuff around a third point, having definitions doesn't make it less messy. It just organizes the mess around something for us to talk about. And so I think about Val Brown, who used to serve on your board. She talks about equity work like hugging a cactus. You have to go into it expecting that it's going to prickle a little bit, right? But you got to hug it. And so you don't hug it with a different expectation, right? So it's a prickly topic because there's a lot of history behind it. And, Carly in the chat actually talked about how, unconscious bias doesn't make you a bad person. It's that it's unconscious. It's the context that we create when it's surfaced that helps to deal with that. And, you talked about brushing your teeth, Sandra, which made me think about Dr. Tatum, Beverly Tatum, who talks about it's pollution. It's all around us. It's baked into the way the world works. Everyone's going to breathe it in, right? And so the way that you start dealing with it is by being hyper conscious at first about everything that you're taking in, and making really deliberate decisions about what you're inhaling, and really over reflecting sometimes on everything that you're breathing, because that's the natural place to start. But then having these standards, having this continuum gives us a place to keep coming back to recalibrate. But I think that we have to remember that there's conditions that we have to also be mindful of. And I think in the standards, I believe in the standards, we talk about the conditions for success, and equity foundations is a part of it, because there has to be a context for the conversation that allows for people to surface these unconscious biases and then individually and collectively work through it, not just flip a switch, right? Like, oh, now I know. So I'm going to go out tomorrow and not be, now I'm conscious, right? So I'm going to go ahead and move on now. There's work to be done. And so I appreciate the way that Marlon talked about just even naming his own identity, and how then that relates to the power that he has and how he interacts with his own, teachers and students. That awareness doesn't change who he is, but it helps him to know how to interact with others. So I appreciate that. I appreciate how nuanced that is. This is not clean work.
Yeah.
It's going to be messy. We're going to be hugging a lot of cacti, and I can't take credit for that. That again was Val Brown, but at least we know what the cactus is now. We're all hugging the same thing with the standards.
Yeah. And I think you said earlier, Ned, I appreciate you saying, like, there's kind of an equity continuum, right? That journey of everybody being on and recognizing, as well as thank you for those listing resources. And if you want to continue to put those, like Glenn Singleton's work with Courageous Conversations, Beverly Tatum's work, Ibram Kendi, among others, that feel free to put in as compelling, especially for our panelists. If you have authors or resources that have really developed and grown your own thinking and challenged your own thinking, that would be great. We have, hopefully about between 5 and 10 minutes left, but I do want to get to the topic around high quality instructional materials and curriculum and the intersection with equity. Because as we all know, even with, the fairly recent TNTP report, the opportunity myth, right, from 2018, something like, unfortunately, only 10% of students of color are actually receiving and having access to grade level assignments, but over 90% are actually completing them to the satisfaction. But that huge gap, right, between rigor and completion and access. So I was hoping, Sandra, if you're really, and I know we don't have a ton of time, but to talk about what is the unique role now with equity, with the field now of curriculum and high quality instruction materials.
Super, super important, because we have made incredible progress, still much to do, but incredible progress in understanding the role that high quality instructional materials have. But it is another one of my promises for 2020 to never talk about materials without talking about practice, because you can put any book in front of a teacher or in front of a student, and it could be the most inviting, inclusive conversation or not. And so it is important that we think about this work. And I know, Student Achievement Partners and working with lots of other agencies are really thinking about the practice of being culturally responsive. I mean, part of it, very critical, is the notion of representation. And I think we have a lot of work to do with our publishing houses and with our, curriculum implementation efforts about getting better models so that everyone sees themselves in the curriculum as well as sees others and good models of others in the curriculum. But for me, one of my many passions lately is to think about, why are we putting a text in front of a kid? What is the math that allows students to bring their own and develop their own math identity and acknowledge the assets that every kid comes to a classroom with? And I worry, just to share my worry with about 100 people on this call, that we think by just adopting the right materials, we'll do the work of cultural responsive practice, and that is not the work. There is work to be done in materials with representation, as I said, but the real work is in this idea of understanding your students as learners, understanding yourself as a teacher, and how to elevate, the affirmation, the meaningful representation of every kid, valuing what every kid brings into the classroom. And materials play a really critical role in that, but it is not just a checkbox to think that if we solve the materials issue, we're getting the work done. Because I've seen too many classrooms directly where there's a very rich, like we'll go in the math, since Marlon mentioned math, a very rich math task, and the teacher right away backs up that task because he or she doesn't believe that the kids in the classroom can handle that scenario, that language, that task. And so materials is a great foundation, but so much work to do to build on those to get to a really great pedagogy of culturally responsive practice.
Yeah, almost not to simplify, but like half the equation, right? Half the equation is putting those instructional materials in front, but then where does the professional learning what does it really look like to drive, right, the understanding of teachers to reach each student? And that's a huge challenge, right?
And if I can, Paul, just reiterate, like building on Natter's point about standards aren't easy, this work isn't about like making it easy. Adopting materials, one of the biggest misconceptions is that people thought high quality means the teachers don't have to think. Good standards doesn't mean you don't have to plan and you don't have to think. This is about focus. This is about creating a common agenda. There's still a heck of a lot of work that needs to happen. And, that's the guardrails that we put for ourselves to make sure that we're all advancing in a way that best meets the needs of students. But for those of you who are in this room as leaders, like not for a minute should you think that your job is to make the job of teaching easy. It isn't easy work. And so, just like agreeing to hug a cactus, like let's acknowledge that that's what we've all signed up for, is leading people through challenging, but yet oh so important.
Yeah, thank you.
Marie, you could go first if you'd like. I saw you unmuted.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was just trying to have equity of voice. I didn't want to talk too much. But when Sandra's talking, one of the things I was thinking about, what's that quote about necessity being the mother of invention or something like that? And I think one of the pluses with all of the challenges we're facing with remote learning is this is the first time that kids can opt out. And when we're talking about attendance, like attendance has become a consuming job for us now. Who's showing up to class? When are they showing up to class? But the important question is, why are they showing up? And there is an equity element to that, because the spaces where they're feeling valued and connected, they're showing up. And to go back to that idea of interest convergence for my teachers, I believe that is becoming contagious, because my teachers don't want to spend their time making attendance phone calls. And so I'm beginning to get some new converts that are beginning to understand now, maybe if I open this session with a restorative circle and plug the kids in, then I can get to the math. I literally had a science lead. We do accelerated high school science programs. And I literally had a science lead have the opportunity to tell 2 or 3 colleagues, the reason you're struggling with attendance is you need to take a step back and make a connection. Kids don't want to just hear about cells and meiosis. They want to make a connection first. And so the benefit of our environment right now is people are beating their heads against the wall, trying to figure out how am I going to get these kids in. And we have to become much more vocal about the fact that when the content engages them, my social studies teachers, I had to yell at them, forgive me, because they were doing maps. And I was like, you have a historic election occurring, history that you've never seen before, new Supreme Court justices, and you guys are doing the Mexican session? But we have to be accountability partners and challenge one another to be creative and to dig deep. But as we're beginning to do that, as kids are beginning to see themselves in the curriculum, as they're beginning to hear their voices, I think that's a plus of this environment, is if it's not engaging, if it's not equitable, if it's not current, then the kids are letting us know. They're voting now with their feet in a way that I think is challenging us.
Thank you. Yeah, Maria.
I just had 2 quick comments. What both of your comments made me think about is the link to professionalization and how we need to ensure the professionalization of teaching. I work with practicing teachers around portfolio assessment, and I'm often surprised at how often our newer teachers are not expected to be curriculum developers or designers, and that there's a scripted curriculum or a very tight curriculum that our school districts have, and empowering teachers and giving them the knowledge and skills through preparation and professional learning to be able to adapt their curriculum or feel empowered to know their students and know to be able to make changes that benefit their students and their learning, I think is really important. And having that as an expectation of a profession, and also equipping teachers with the knowledge and skills to be able to do that, and the expectation. And then the second thing, just to second your comment, Sandra, is that that's what the research says around materials. We found some studies that showed teachers who had a really high quality curriculum given to them for them to employ, actually their students did worse than the original curriculum when that wasn't coupled with professional learning around the new curricular materials. So this expectation that curriculum alone is going to solve our problems without acknowledging the professional role of teachers and the need for their professional learning is, has been debunked by research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I think that's a huge point of also, I think, Marie, you said a while ago, also considering to think differently now about measuring student engagement, and how do we embed student engagement now into, as Marlon was saying, and everyone is saying on the panel, it's a legitimate piece of policy, right? And even of accountability is factoring in and starting to measure student engagement with curriculum, with other students and with educators, right? And to do that. Hopefully, we are going to wrap up this piece, but I think, I wish, like, the Wallace Foundation actually has this great applause, football stadium applause that I wish we had right now for our panelists, because of how amazing they've been. So please kind of join me virtually in applauding them and our panel, because if you're like me, I think we'll want to go back to this recording and to unpack everything that has been shared today, both in the chat box, which you'll receive, and also from our panelists. Knowing this big, issue and core shift of needing, right, to think deeply about changing the mindsets, the policies, the practices, and the tools to really drive and embed equity more fully into all of our systems. And I think that's what all four of our panelists have said so eloquently. So a huge thank you to them. We're going to continue with this last piece of our session today, and that is going to take us back to our colleague Tracy's now really starting to unpack briefly the revised standards that touch upon so many of the themes that we were just talking about, which is exciting, as we all know from our standards team work and advisory council, and also give you as audience members just a very quick opportunity to give us feedback based on what you're about to hear from that. So Tracy, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, and I think we're going to see some slides, and we invite you, if you want to have your camera on, we love seeing your faces while we talk through this. And just loved all the questions you brought to the chat box and the work that is behind this and why you're interested in going deeper here. So thanks so much for this. Okay, so you see the slide of our diagram of draft revised standards for professional learning. So we've put this draft out there just a couple days ago. We're going to have it out to the field for 6 weeks, and we're hoping to get as much feedback as possible and a little bit later, Elizabeth will share the link, hoping that you'll have a chance to provide feedback at whatever level you can fit in, but we just so much will appreciate your expertise on this. So I'll just talk you through what we have in the draft so far. In our pretty tricolor diagram here, you see 10 standards in 3 categories, sort of in that framework of a learning system. And the frame, so we have conditions for success. So this is sort of the foundational aspects of what are the context pieces we need to have in place so that high quality professional learning can happen. And so in that category, and we're going to talk through each of these just a little bit, but this is where you find leadership. This is where you find resources and culture of collaborative inquiry. And you'll see that in each of these categories, there is an explicit equity standard. So this is where equity foundations is. And this is where we think, okay, at the conditions level, what are the equity pieces that we must have in place? What's the vision we need to have in place? And how do we think about the context that makes it possible for all educators to have access to high quality professional learning and for them to be ready to teach all students so that they have high quality teaching and learning? So we've pulled that out as a separate standard. In the transformational processes area of the frame, that's the how of learning, the processes behind professional learning. And our equity drivers standard, that's where and so I'm thinking about Stephanie Hirsch raised a question in the chat box about, okay, you can talk about culturally responsive teaching practices, and you can talk about what do educators need to know and be able to do so that they can teach all students. What is it that the system needs to know and be able to do so that educators have access to that kind of teaching and learning? So it's like there are so many layers to this, and that's why you see a standard in each section of the frame. Also in the transformational processes area, there's evidence, how we use data and evidence and research to inform learning and to plan learning, learning designs and implementation. And then in the rigorous and inclusive content area of the frame, and this is the what of educator learning. And there you see 2 standards, curriculum assessment and instruction, and the reaching each student standard. So we've put them in this frame. And those of you who have been standards fanboys and girls for many years know that the 2001 standards had a frame of context, process, content. And the echoes are here. This is very similar in terms of thinking about the how, the what, and the context for learning. So as we look at the next slide, and we're just listing the 10 standards. So our current standards have 7. Now we're at 10, which is not surprising since we just named 3 equity standards. But when we look at that conditions frame, and I just kind of talked through these. One thing that's different, if you're familiar with the 2011 standards, we have the learning communities standard in 2011. In this draft, we're calling that the culture of collaborative inquiry. And part of that is because people bring a lot of meanings to the term learning communities. And when we look at it with Learning Forward, it is beyond a learning design, to use our own language here, and looking at the culture, the values, the leadership, the vision for how folks work in collaboration in continuous improvement cycles. And that goes through every aspect of the high quality professional learning we describe in standards. Leadership and resources, just as in the 2011 standards, so critical that educators have sufficient resources, and we know the role of the leader in establishing and sustaining and modeling professional learning is critical. And when we say leader here, leader is not limited to those with formal leadership titles and positions. Every educator has the power and the obligation to demonstrate leadership through their actions and through their values. On the next slide, we'll look at the processes standards. So this is where the drivers I was talking about in terms of equity. So what is it that happens in the how of the learning so that all adult learners have access to high quality learning? Evidence, we have the data standard in 2011. This covers similar ground, also really calls out the role of research as well. And evidence is so critical in planning and assessing and monitoring professional learning. And learning designs and implementation, so tightly linked together in when we think about what do we know about how folks learn and what do we know about how people change, and the change research and the research about learning. And then in the content, the 2 content standards, curriculum, assessment, and instruction. And we talk at some depth here about the critical role of high quality instructional materials and curriculum, and in the reaching each student standard. What is it that educators need to learn so that they can really honor and recognize each student's the aspects of identity that they bring to classrooms, and how do we celebrate the assets they bring to us? So that was very quickly, just ran through those 10 standards, and I hope that you'll get a chance to review the draft. So I threw a lot at you there with the new standards. Some of you have seen some early drafts of this. So glad that we have so many of our consultants, our affiliate members, foundation folks, longtime members. So great to have you here. And I think that now we're going to use a Padlet. And we kind of just want to, we followed up this great conversation with our folks on the equity panel, and thinking about that conversation and where we aspire to go with standards. And remember, this is a draft, so these will get better and better, especially with your input. But we just kind of want to hear your initial impressions, and feel free to have that equity lens. Elizabeth, I think you're going to share a Padlet link in the chat box. And there are 3 questions on the Padlet. And one is, what is it that you're excited about? What is it you have questions about? What do you have concerns about? I don't think I'm saying the right questions, but when you get there, you'll see them. And we would love for the next 3 or 4 minutes for you to put in your initial impressions when you see our draft list of standards there. So there's our link. And this will take you to the Padlet app. It's going to open up in your browser, most likely. And there's an opportunity, questions about the standard so far. What are you most excited about? What are you most concerned about? And you see that there's a little plus sign, and that's your opportunity to add your own sticky note under each question. So we're just going to take a few minutes. So glad to see he's coming up here. Question that's come up both in the chat box and the Padlet already. I know Paula's going to talk a little bit about our timeline. As we said, we're putting this draft out now. We'll get feedback from y'all by mid-January, and then we will revise the draft based on the input we get. And throughout the course of 2021, we will be creating implementation tools, and they will go live in early 2022, which sounds like it's a long time away. It's not as far as we think. Until that time, we know that the standards that we have are the standards that we use. And meanwhile, we all bring new understanding and new depth of understanding to what those all mean. So I hope that your peek into what these are and what they will become will help you enrich what you do with the existing standards. So I love to see what's coming up in the chat box. We're going to take just a couple more minutes on this.
Yeah, and Tracy, it might be helpful while the folks are doing this if you wanted to walk through the next piece, right? Because that's the example standard and showing that, because that might give a little more context too, right? For thinking about and learning what's in an actual standard.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so we will do that. And Elizabeth, would you share them? I think you've got some slides that show what's in each standard. So for each of the 10 standards, we are, in addition to the statement, which I showed you the statement on the previous slides, but we have an overview that describes 3 key concepts for each standard. And the one we're looking at there on the screen is the culture of collaborative inquiry. But we have in this standard, commit to and drive continuous improvement, engage in collaborative learning, and take shared responsibility. So you'll see that for each of the standards. There are also resources and/or references that we cite in the standards. And then on the next slide, we also, for each standard, because we're trying to build in to the extent possible implementation support, we list essential actions for each standard. These are aligned to what you read in the overview, and we just outline 6 to 8 essential actions. So for example, here, for those educators who are implementing professional learning, what is it they do? One example is they possess a deep understanding of the interrelatedness of standards and how collaborative teams use standards to advance continuous improvement. Or they use continuous improvement frameworks, tools, and resources to support teachers and leaders working together. So we get into some detail there. This is not a comprehensive list, but these are sort of, this is what it looks like on several key points in the standards. Another piece you'll see in each standard on the next slide is we've crafted a vignette that shows a learning journey when the standard is in action. So for example, with this standard, you know, in a particular context, what does it look like when a system builds a culture of collaborative inquiry? And we're pretty concerned with showing a learning journey. We know that people enter these standards from a variety of different points and from so many different education contexts. And so we're showing a learning journey here and what it looks like. And as with current standards, you can't really separate one from another. So in every vignette, you will see evidence of leadership. you will see evidence of equity concerns. You know, when we're in the evidence standard, for example, they're looking at data about why aren't there students of color performing at high levels, and what are they going to do about it? You see curriculum materials are throughout all of these. These things are so interlocked together. But in each vignette, we're trying to highlight aspects of the key standard that you're looking at. So that's what you'll see for each of the standards. And we just can't wait to hear. So not only are these the right standards, but is what we're presenting helpful to you around those? Are these the right pieces? So I think, Elizabeth, would you share the link? I think you probably all got an email. And we're going to, there we go. Excellent. If you're on our mailing list, you probably got an email when we were sitting in the keynote saying, we invite you to review the standards. So I hope you have that link, but we're going to put it everywhere. And download the draft, share the link. If you have folks who you think maybe should take a look at this, we'd love to have you pass it along, and take your opportunity to give us input. We have a lengthy survey in there. We know you may not have an opportunity to read in great depth, but to whatever degree you want to offer input, we so appreciate it. And you can also email Paul all you want. So with that, Paul, I'm going to ask you to share kind of our timeline, and then we know we have to get to a next session. We only have a half-hour break, and I'm sure you've all got another session to go to.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. And also really appreciate all your comments. That'll be helpful in the Padlet questions. I know one of them was just quickly I'll share is the worry about having 10 standards and where to start, right? And so one of our pieces we're committed to is making sure we have strong implementation tools with the release of the standards, as you see on the screen, when we get to the final production and release, because there will be some strong assessment tools to know where to start and to see how the work and the standards connect with each other. And that's by design, that we don't want to, in other words, release the standards separate from all the implementation and monitoring tools that will be part of it. So again, thank you so much for both your reactions on those questions, because that will help us inform and be part of this initial feedback. So what you can see is we did release them, this what we call the revised draft over the weekend, and it will be exactly till January 15th. And Elizabeth, I believe, put that in the link or in the chat for the link to see the actual draft standards and the survey that we would ask you. And ideally, if you're even able to share that with folks, your own group, in your own environments, and your own colleagues, if they don't have access to this, to get their feedback would be great by January 15th, since that is kind of our 6-week window for the public feedback. We are also going to be working then, starting and have already begun the work on, as I mentioned, what are these true impactful implementation tools? Many of you know the IC maps, the implementation configuration maps that we will continue to update and revise, as well as other tools for role-alike individuals. So in other words, Marlon, being a principal, would have a suite of tools to think about how to really drive implementation of the standards into his building, for example. And that's where 2021 is going to be all about, that design and creation for those tools in collaboration with our district work team, our district and policy and province work team for the Standards Advisory Council, with the target date of having kind of a second draft then of those revised standards with some tools that would be, we would be giving feedback and giving an opportunity, hopefully, for some of our advisory council members to have to test out and to give feedback, especially on the implementation tools as well. And then I think if you just jump back a moment on the last date there on the slide before, you'll see the actual goal there for not just continuing tool development in 2021 throughout. As Tracy said, it's going to be here faster than we realize, but also the release, final production release of early 2022, both of the standards and the tools. So that's really where we're going with the timeline. With that, I know as Tracy mentioned, and maybe I will turn it back if Denise is to say any final thoughts to take us out for this panel on equity. I know she was with us a few minutes ago. I'm not sure if she's
I'm
still
here. Yes.
Oh, there you are. Great. Sorry, Denise.
I was just looking for my
yeah, exactly.
turn the mic back on. But this, I'm sure that everyone here has just so appreciated this incredible panel that we had, and the real connection and ideas in sharing and insights, which have just been so tremendous. So can't thank you enough. And also all of the comments about how the standards can really be a lever for so much improvement and for equity. So I just appreciate the conversation, your insights, and all that you shared today with all of our almost 100 people. And I just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, great. And again, thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you all, and hope you have a great rest of this conference. And we are done. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Can I just add one thing? I just put, we have a session evaluation form. I just put the link in the chat box. If you would take a few minutes and just complete that, you'll need to note the session ID number, which is 1211. So thank you for just helping us gather even more feedback, and it helps us shape our sessions for the conference as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.